Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle, which is coming right up, but first, a few thoughts of my own. Well, actually thoughts to do with the subject we're going to be discussing today, which is cancer research. You might say that cancer is the sum of all fears of our concerns about health. It is probably the thing that most people worry about the most, that strikes the most terror into them. And we have had a war on cancer in the US for many decades, and yet it is not totally licked. Certainly your chances of surviving are a lot better than they used to be. We now know there are many cancers and many treatments, but sadly, as in other diseases, government funding, the really base of the war on cancer, has eroded and is now really remarkably small. So it is up to private charities to take up some of the slack and to provide some continuity in research rather than the sort of pulsed funding that comes from government. Too much money, too little money. It's a tale across the board that we have in the US, each gyration, if you will, being influenced by the political tenor of the time and concern over budgets and other things. So today we've got two very distinguished people, one of whom runs one of the most important but small private cancer funds that finds money for research and gives it in contracts over a long period of time to researchers. So there's continuity, there's not a zigzagging and up and down. And the other is one of our foremost cancer researchers. You're going to meet these two extraordinary men and their noble endeavors on behalf of this still terrifying and not totally, far from totally conquered disease when we get back. Franklin Salisbury, you are the president of the National Foundation for Cancer Research. Welcome to the broadcast. And
thank you, sir.
We're delighted to have you here. What is your organization?
The National Foundation for Cancer Research is a charity that funds basic science research. That's our mission. And it's important because in many ways we're as if the venture capitalists of cancer research, finding research that no one has thought to look at, underwriting discoveries, helping innovative scientists get in the lab with that research and then getting that research off the ground. That's what we do.
And you raise money to that purpose?
Yes, with the grassroots support of the American public. Hundreds of thousands of Americans who give $5, $10, $15 so we can fund basic science research.
And Dr. Kurt Siven of the University of Maryland School of Medicine, welcome to the broadcast. And you are a bench scientist as well as being an administrator at the University of Maryland. You actually are working with cancer cells.
Thank you, Llewellyn. It's great to be here. And yes, I do. We do cancer research, and we've been doing that for about 35 years.
And how is cancer research done? How do you operate? We talk about research, but we really have very little idea what happens when the lab door closes.
Well, it's interesting. I can tell you a little story about that. A lot more of what we do with cancer nowadays has to do with and uses the tools of genetics. So we use DNA and we use RNA and we study the DNA and the RNA. Back when I started, we were focused on the cancer cells as the units that went wrong. That's still absolutely correct. But now we can see exactly what goes wrong in the blueprints and the workings of those cells, figure out what's happening and try to block that, try to attack that.
Franklin, NFCR has been around for about 40 years. It was in fact founded by your father, so good works are in the blood, as it were. Give us some examples. I understand that you fund some of Dr. Siven's work. How does that function?
Well, what Dr. Siven just brought up is so important because when I think about it, 25 years ago, well, an unfunded area of research was metastasis. How cells spread.
This is the thing which can go from a little thing on the skin to a fatal infection.
Exactly. In fact, with most people, they seldom die of their primary tumor. It's when the cell metastasizes or spreads. But 25 years ago, few were looking at that function. But NFCR was very interested in what Dr. Sivan was describing, molecular genetics. And another scientist, Danny Welch, was also looking at that. And with our funding, he discovered a gene, the KIS1 gene, that suppresses metastasis in cancer cells. We've now been funding Danny for over 2 decades. And with our funding, with our support, he has now found 6 cancer suppressor genes. This is 2 decades of research. And we're now on the cusp of what might be a whole new way of treating cancer, of suppressing metastasis.
Kurt, how important has the steady funding? It's not huge, I understand, but it's steady. I mentioned this earlier on. How, in your work, getting to this point of being on the cusp, as Franklin just said, has the fact that the private foundation can keep a steady rate of funding, how important is that?
It's just fundamentally important. Without it, we couldn't do anything that involved any sort of risk. The best ideas have to have some element of risk of being wrong. And that's what we test in experiments in the lab. If we tested only things that were sure things, we would have only incremental improvements at best. The example is best illustrated in pediatric oncology.
Which is your specialty?
I'm a pediatric oncologist, and when I started
for people who are not familiar with the term, this is a doctor who treats children with cancer. A truly terrible situation.
And it was even more terrible in the 1970s. I remember as a medical student seeing my first patient with a childhood cancer, a leukemia, and the senior doctor who was teaching me said, be very quiet, be very sensitive in the room, because this child is going to live only 2 more months, and that's what we have to tell the family. Today, we cure 80% of kids with cancer, but as a pediatric oncologist, you spend most of your time on the kids you can't cure, and even the kids you can cure will have side effects. It's a long treatment. It's devastating financially. We have to change things grossly. We have to change it from a war on cancer where we're using cluster bombs to a caring, curing treatment that affects only the cancer cells. That's what we're trying to do now. And those ideas have big risks and take a long time to prove. Without stable funding, you can't take on those risks.
Federal funding, Franklin, is diminishing. It's remarkably small, isn't it? How is that affecting you? Is there more demand on your services, if we can put it that way?
There's a great demand for our services, our funding, but we're a charity. And it's only with the support of the American public, the grassroots support, that we're able to raise money for cancer research. But you know, this war against cancer, more than 1,500 people a day are still dying of cancer. And unless and until we can work together, we're not going to cure cancer. But you know, an important point that Dr. Sivan made, here we've been funding your research for over 2 decades now. NFCR provides the seed funding. That's an important analogy because, like a seed, research has to be nurtured because that's how the seed bears fruit. And as you can hear from Dr. Sivan, his research is bearing fruit. It's making a difference. And we are giving patients with cancer hope and promise.
Is there anything with that which you disagree? Is it bothersome to you that the government is shirking its responsibility and private charities are having to take up some of the load?
Yeah, it's said by many scientists that the system of funding cancer research today is broken. We're not funding enough of the truly great ideas. We're not really sustaining our researchers, our established researchers, especially our young researchers that we've worked so hard to build a community of. But let me tell you a story about NFCR funding. That story starts in my lab. We were working on the differences between leukemia cells, the cancer that I study, and that's the most common cancer in children, but is a very common cancer in adults as well, particularly older adults. And we're studying these cancers and comparing their DNA and their RNA to normal cells at the same stage. We developed the technology.
For our viewers and listeners, RNA is?
So the dogma...
What does RNA stand for?
Ribonucleic acid. And DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid.
DNA is sort of commonly known, but RNA less so, I think.
So the dogma that I grew up with was DNA is the blueprint. From DNA is made RNA, which is the messenger. And so that message goes out from the nucleus of the cell, the center of the cell, where the DNA is, out into the periphery of the cell, where the manufacturing plants are, where they make the proteins under the instructions, the message of the RNA. And we were looking at this RNA that leukemia cells make for differences compared to normal cells. We could do that with modern technology that came along at about the turn of this latest century, about the years 2002 or 3. And we were looking at not only the large RNA, but we were looking at the small RNA. Well, why would we look at small RNA? I'd been taught that the small RNA was kind of like molecular sawdust, that when in the course of being a good message, an RNA had to be cut apart to the right size to work to make proteins and to deliver that message accurately. The saws weren't perfect. There was always some sawdust. And the sawdust was small RNAs, and I was taught, don't study it. And I taught my students, don't study it. That's just sawdust. Study the logs. Well, people started, and there was a very important discovery by another NFCR-funded scientist, Dr. Carlo Croce, a friend of mine, and we were at the same symposium. And the quandary that we couldn't figure out looked like it might be explained by his discovery that the microRNAs were important. So we started to look at this sawdust and teamed with him, because we learn things by collaborations and interactions. That's the other good thing in science, and particularly at NFCR, with putting together and leveraging this science.
You make the point about you have to be a bit heretical in order to do it. We're going to take a little break for station identification, primarily for the benefit of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, channel 124, the POTUS channel. I am Llewellyn King, and you are listening to White House Chronicle, coming to you from Washington, D.C. Today we are discussing cancer research with two hugely important players in that field. One is Franklin Salisbury, Jr., president of the National Foundation for Cancer Research, which raises money and gives it to entrepreneurial researchers, using entrepreneurial in a scientific rather than a financial sense. And Dr. Kurt Sivan, the University of Maryland School of Medicine, which is one of the frontier places for research into cancer. His specialty is cancer in children, and he has had some considerable success in finding how cancer travels through the body, how cells multiply and are transported, and he's done that largely by studying the DNA of the cancer cell as well as the cancer itself. And he wouldn't have gotten there without help from Franklin Salisbury Jr. and the National Foundation of Cancer Research. How do you pick the projects you support? Because you're planning in each case to support them for many years. How does that work? Do people apply to you? Do you go find them? Do you say that's a good idea, we should put some dollars into that to keep it going or get it going? What's the dynamic there?
I want to say both and, but as Dr. Sivan described, we work with our scientists. We don't just give the money away. And in working with the scientists we support, we are able to find others with other innovative ideas that need support. And using a peer review committee of scientists, we're able to tell whether or not these research avenues, these directions, are worthy of support. And that's how we fund the research we support.
That's very interesting. And this is a sort of open, ongoing, conversational, if you would, it's a schmooze at the highest level of medicine that you learn about other projects or very gifted people who need funding.
Exactly. In fact, though, it's important because oftentimes research doesn't go where the scientist wants it to go. Many times the scientist will find discoveries that they never imagined. And unless and until the research funding can help the scientists take the research to those new directions, it goes nowhere.
The inadvertence of science is fascinating, isn't it?
Isn't it? Serendipity. We're not talking about miracles. We're talking about tenacity of purpose, doing the research to discover what might be a cure for cancer.
We talk in America a lot about, are we losing our place as a world leader, etc. And we have sort of fairly narrow criteria for deciding what makes a leader. But we've always been a leader, or in the last 100 years more or less, a leader in scientific research, taking over from probably Britain and France. Are we going to be able to maintain that leadership, or is it endangered?
Well, I think you're right. I think we should see leadership in innovation and creativity sort of like maybe Switzerland sees watches and banks. That in Switzerland, if the watch industry were threatened, every citizen, every part of government would be concerned and would be taking serious measures to try to sustain that industry. Our industry, American industry, is innovation and creativity for the benefit of the world.
I want you to give me an example, if you can, Kurt, of some research that came up with a cure or a solution to a problem that wasn't intended and not the road you were going down for some other purpose. Does one come to mind?
Yes.
Besides the discovery of penicillin.
Well, I'll do one that's close to home that isn't at the level of penicillin yet. But earlier I was talking about these small bits of RNA we call microRNAs. We found imbalances. We found a difference in the leukemia cells compared to the normal cells. They didn't have enough of these microRNAs. When we restored the levels of these microRNAs, it killed the leukemias.
Something a question that I have, and that is when you have these terrible childhood cancers, largely but not totally leukemia, this sort of mitigates against environmental triggers. These tend to be hereditary or defects in the gene rather than environmental. We think of carcinogens in the environment as being cigarettes, etc., etc. Yes. But in fact, cancer has many fathers, doesn't it?
Yes, and cigarettes, for example, take 20 or 30 years to cause a cancer if you're unlucky, but in a high percent in those 20 or 30 years. In childhood, defined as up to age 18 or 21, there definitionally isn't enough time for a carcinogen as powerful as tobacco to work. Fortunately, we've gotten most of those powerful carcinogens out of our lives. So now we see the much more subtle effects of genetics. Only about less than 1% of even childhood cancer, though, is inherited. The damage occurs, as mistakes in the DNA that are more like typographical errors, typos, that happen. When I'm writing a letter, I always make a typo. The word processing software on the computer fixes some of those, and it messes up others. I make an analogy to what happens in the DNA of a cancer cell, that accumulated errors, when they accumulate in such a way that instead of I'm sending you a bill, instead it's I have to pay you money, a cancer, that enough of those mutations occur that it becomes a cancer. Then it's our job as a scientist, I view it as my job as a pediatric oncologist, to find ways to attack that very mutation, those very mutations, and turn those into susceptibilities, to Achilles heels. That's what we're doing now. With these microRNA changes, we've found a drug. And we found a whole series of drugs that are used today widely. They're a miracle drug to treat malaria.
Good gracious.
And they're active against cancer cells, particularly leukemia cells.
Extraordinary. I want to ask you, there is a lot of bad publicity for charities. They're accused of lack of transparency, of using too much money to pay salaries and overhead and not enough going to the declared purpose. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the transparency issue? I know you have views on it.
We are completely transparent, and there are laws governing these issues. The IRS will only, shall we say, give a charity a 501c3 status so long as it's being and spending the money, raising the money according to the laws, according to the accounting standards. And so we're people to look at the laws, we're people to look at and examine the audited financial statements. These would not be issues. They're issues only when they don't look. And too often that doesn't happen. People don't look, and they take for granted what they're being told. Unfortunately, that's not the case. NFCR is approved by the Better Business Bureau, where we raise money in all of the states that in America. Because again, it's with the grassroots support of the American public that we're able to raise the money to support scientists like Dr. Sivan. And to do that, we have to be completely transparent. Anyone might go to our website at www.nfcr.
I hope they will, not for that purpose,
well, no, but
maybe to help support your work.
I hope so, but we are completely transparent, and most charities in America are as well.
What do you say to people about the chances of surviving cancer today, after decades of the war on cancer?
It's much better, and in all cancers overall, it's over 50%. But again, that means that 50% have to go through a great deal. A neighbor of mine, about my age, just developed a cancer, and talking her through what she's going to go through, and her talking me through what it felt like for her side, is always very, very moving. It should be more like a cold. It should be more like the doctor's role is to say, take 2 of these particular pills and call me in the morning.
Franklin, how can we tell the world about this deficit in the financing of basic scientific research in cancer and in other things? Is there a bellow of rage that can be heard?
There should be. And you mentioned genetics and likened it to inherited diseases. But what Dr. Sivan was describing were genetic mutations. We now have been able to match drugs with the genetic mutations that oftentimes drive the growth of cancer. Call that genomics, call that targeted cancer therapies. Others call it personalized medicine. We're there, yet too few people, too few doctors even know about it. That's something that needs to be told. That's something that needs to be done if we're going to cure cancer.
And my final question to you, Kurt, is how do you spread the word in the community? How does the local doctor learn what you have learned? What are the mechanisms for getting the word out?
Well, there are many, but I'll give you one. We have a course at the University of Maryland School of Medicine which a student may elect to take where they get their DNA sequence on a computer chip, and they plug that into their computer and they study it. And they learn how to study their DNA and what they should know about their DNA as a translation to what they should tell a patient.
Doesn't that create all sorts of anxieties and fears? I would think it would be could be a very trying thing to know what your DNA, what would you say, Franklin?
It might be, but that's why we need doctors who understand and appreciate just what we're talking about, so they can help not only allay the anxiety, but help the people whose DNA is being studied understand and appreciate what they've got to do to keep from getting cancer.
I want, as we conclude, just to make it clear that people can find you, Franklin. It's the National Foundation for Cancer Research in Bethesda, Maryland, and they can get in touch with you there. You're at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. You two are the most gifted and interesting men I have had the pleasure of interviewing on this program. Thank you for coming on the broadcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Kurt, pleasure.
White House Chronicle is produced in collaboration with WHUT, Howard University Television. From Washington, D.C., this has been White House Chronicle, a weekly analysis of the news with insight and a sense of humor, featuring Llewellyn King, Linda Gasparello, and guests. This program may be seen on PBS stations and cable access channels. To view the program online, visit us at whitehousechronicle.com.